The moment a parent learns their child is not okay, the whole world stops. The air gets thin, every sound fades away, and nothing, absolutely nothing, can prepare you for the weight of that truth. This is a story about that moment, but it is also a story about what happens after the doctors leave the room when a family must decide who they are going to be. It's a dramatized tale inspired by royal themes, but it is not real. It is not confirmed. It is simply a story about love, fear, and the courage it takes to put a child first. It's about a father who had to speak a painful truth to the world, a mother who would do anything to protect her son's spirit, and an aunt whose quiet strength held them all together. This is the story of a diagnosis, a family's private war, and the promise that changed everything. The prince walked into that briefing room at the ancient castle without an army of advisors behind him. No communication experts, no strategists. He walked in with his aunt, the princess, close enough to catch him if he fell. That image alone tells you everything about where the real power sits in this family. It isn't in titles or crowns. It is in the people willing to stand beside you when your voice breaks. The room was silent as he placed both palms on the table and began to read a statement that had clearly been rehearsed many times. The words were careful. They said that his youngest son had received a formal diagnosis. It was a rare condition that would affect his coordination, his movement, and his physical stability. There would be long-term treatment, fewer public appearances, and major changes to his daily routine. The prince got to the phrase, "our youngest son," and his voice just broke. It cracked open right there in front of everyone. His aunt lowered her eyes to protect him in that moment, not out of discomfort, but because she understood exactly what that crack in his composure would unleash once the news spread. She had been arguing with him for weeks about this moment. She believed silence was dangerous, that letting rumors spread would be worse than speaking openly. But the prince was terrified that saying it out loud would trap his son inside a label he never chose. His wife, the princess, was caught in the middle. She was furious at the idea of reducing her child to a palace statement. That conflict sat between all of them as they stood united in front of the cameras. The fact that they were able to present a unified front, given what had been happening in private, is kind of remarkable. The diagnosis did not come out of nowhere. Specialists had been tracking unexplained fatigue, unstable movement, and moments when the boy struggled to control his hands. The symptoms would appear and then disappear, which is why early medical checks pointed toward exhaustion or a temporary problem. The princess noticed every single change, but the symptoms were so inconsistent that she feared alarming her son before anyone understood what was truly happening. The prince clung to the exhaustion explanation because it offered hope. He told himself that rest would restore the boy's strength and the family could keep life normal. That belief completely collapsed during a private rehearsal at the castle. The family was practicing timing and movement for a future event. The youngest boy crossed the room toward his father and suddenly lost control of his balance. There was no obstacle in his path, no playful distraction. In one moment he was moving forward. In the next he was on the floor, confused and frightened. His father rushed toward him. The entire room froze. The child tried to rise but couldn't make his legs respond. The prince dropped beside him and asked him to squeeze both hands. The boy gripped one hand firmly but the other barely moved. The look on the prince's face shifted from worry to terror in an instant. The princess saw several staff members still staring and ordered the room cleared with an anger born from panic, not pride. His aunt moved immediately, closing the doors and instructing staff to remove every unofficial reference to the incident from the internal schedule. She was not going to allow a child's fear to become palace gossip. A physician examined the boy moments later and recognized the pattern immediately. The fall matched the earlier fatigue, the unstable balance, the weak grip. He urged immediate neurological testing while warning the prince that delay could cost valuable treatment time. That is when the aunt discovered something that made her anger turn cold. 2 previous episodes had been dismissed by junior staff as childish clumsiness. She demanded names, dates, and every written account. The prince followed the specialist into a private chamber and asked the question no father wants to speak aloud. Would his son recover completely? The doctor paused before answering. That silence struck harder than any diagnosis. So the fall created the emergency, but the final test results created an entirely different battle. The prince, the princess, and the aunt were about to disagree fundamentally over whether protecting the boy meant keeping the truth hidden or speaking before someone else did. This argument did not take place in front of advisors or doctors. It happened behind a closed door with no aides present. Just the 3 of them facing a question no protocol could answer. The prince feared losing control of the story. The princess feared losing control of her child's life. The aunt feared hesitation would allow others to make the decision for them. The princess read the final diagnostic report twice before setting it down. The specialists had confirmed the disorder was serious yet manageable with early and sustained treatment. Hope remained, but only if the boy received time, protection, and freedom from unnecessary pressure. Palace communication officials had already drafted a limited statement because canceled family appearances were attracting attention. To the prince, silence was becoming dangerous. The princess pushed the draft back across the table and said it sounded cold, distant, almost constitutional. She said nothing, and it captured the fear her son had shown after the fall or the confusion in his voice when adults lowered theirs around him. She told the prince, "He is our son, not a palace statement." He answered that refusing to speak would not stop the story. If fragments leaked first, their child would be exposed without protection. His voice rose when she accused him of thinking like an heir before thinking like a father. He insisted he was doing both because he had no choice. She told him that choice was exactly what their son was losing. The aunt remained silent through all of this, but the tension sharpened around her because she had watched them carry grief in different ways, and now those differences were breaking into the open. Then the aunt dropped the information that changed the entire calculation. Through a private household briefing she had personally reviewed, she revealed that someone within the wider royal staff had already requested access to the boy's revised schedule. She refused to identify the person until she knew why the request had been made, but the warning was enough. The secret was already moving beyond the family. She proposed a joint confirmation led by the prince with herself beside him to block intrusive pressure. The princess would remain with the child, far from the machinery surrounding the announcement. The prince stood and moved toward the door, and the princess stopped him by saying his name. He turned, and she pressed the medical file against his chest and told him that if he spoke, he must speak as a father, not as the future king. The aunt set down her pen and promised that no royal timetable would ever outrank the boy's treatment. The family had reached agreement, but courage alone was not going to protect the child. Because inside the monarchy, compassion does not always control the calendar. This is where the aunt's role becomes absolutely critical. The prince may be the heir, but in the hours after the diagnosis, it became clear that his aunt understands how to turn grief into action in a way that nobody else in that family does. She knows which officials will cooperate, which traditions can be suspended, and which voices will resist behind polite expressions. Her power does not come from a crown waiting in the future. It comes from decades of service, and an unwillingness to let royal machinery consume a vulnerable child. She began by reviewing every obligation attached to the boy's name. Family appearances, ceremonial rehearsals, travel plans, events requiring prolonged standing, all of it placed under immediate scrutiny. Every entry now carried a different weight. What once looked routine could leave the child exhausted, exposed, or frightened. The prince gave his aunt full authority to negotiate the changes. He was moving between medical consultations, his wife, and his other children, while guilt followed him everywhere. He worried that asking his aunt to fight the institution meant abandoning his own duty. She ended that thought with one sentence: "Your place is where your son looks for you." He fell silent because he knew she was right. The aunt faced resistance almost immediately. Several officials warned that removing the boy from public occasions would create visible gaps and encourage speculation. She could hear the calculation beneath their concern. They were protecting appearance while a child was learning how to trust his own body again. Her anger rose, but she controlled it because one uncontrolled confrontation could turn the boy's treatment into a wider palace battle. Then she discovered an old household protocol, requiring young royal children to maintain limited ceremonial participation unless they are physically incapable. She rejected the wording immediately. Emotional safety and active treatment, she argued, must be enough. A child should not have to collapse before tradition allows him to rest. A senior official still refused to cancel one major appearance, warning that the absence could dominate headlines and weaken public confidence. The aunt placed the specialist's written recommendation on the table and accepted personal responsibility for overriding the schedule. When the official continued explaining the reputational consequences, she closed the engagement book with one firm movement and said the discussion was over. She left the meeting and entered an empty side room where for one brief moment her shoulders fell and the strength drained from her face. Then the prince called. She answered with a steady voice and told him the calendar had been changed. The first battle was won. But the deeper damage was already beginning, because the princess was about to discover that people no longer see her son before they see his diagnosis. The morning after the announcement, the castle felt unfamiliar to the family living inside it. Messages arrived from across the world. Security procedures changed. Staff began speaking more carefully whenever the boy entered a room. Nothing openly cruel occurred, but the princess noticed something that frightened her almost as much as the diagnosis itself. People were no longer reacting to her son before they reacted to his condition. In trying to show concern, the palace had begun making him feel watched. The boy faced changes he never chose. His public engagements were suspended. His schooling was adjusted. Medical therapy became part of every week. His parents explained the diagnosis in simple words. His body needs extra help with balance and movement, but he is still exactly the same boy. The child wanted to believe them. Then an aide reached for an item he had always carried alone. The boy pulled it back sharply, asking why everyone suddenly thinks he cannot do anything. The princess heard the anger beneath the question. It was not only frustration, it was fear that the diagnosis had changed how every adult measures him. She confronted the household later that day, not shouting but with every word landing with force. Support must never become humiliation. Staff must ask before touching, carrying, guiding, or stepping in. Her grief hardened into protection because kindness without respect can still wound, and she refused to let concerns steal her son's independence. Meanwhile, the prince received a private message from a trusted communications advisor warning that details beyond the official statement were circulating. Details mentioning the weak grip, the sudden fall, and the delayed response of one hand. Those facts were never released. Someone had spoken about the castle rehearsal. The aunt began tracing every person present during the incident. Through a documented internal account, she discovered that one aide had contacted an external advisor shortly after the fall, believing the palace needed to prepare for a possible public crisis. The decision may have come from fear, but it placed the boy's private pain in dangerous hands. The boy later tried to cross a garden path alone. Halfway through, his confidence broke and he stopped. The prince did not rush forward. He waited until his son reached out and then took his hand without lifting or carrying him. That small choice said what words cannot. The prince removed the boy's prepared schedule from the notice board that evening and replaced it with a blank sheet, telling his wife that their son's life would no longer be arranged around royal expectation. But the deepest wound remained hidden because the boy was about to tell his aunt what he feared most, and it had nothing to do with treatment. The crisis changed direction not in a formal meeting, but during a private conversation between a grandmother-like aunt and a frightened child. With no advisors, cameras, or medical language between them, the boy finally admitted what the diagnosis had made him believe. He was not most afraid of treatment. He was afraid his father would stop being proud of him. For the aunt, that confession exposed the true battle the family must now fight. She had been spending more time alone with the boy after noticing how quiet he became whenever the prince entered the room. The child watched his father closely, measuring every step, every pause, every unsteady movement against the prince's reaction. The boy had overheard adults discussing which royal duties must now be cancelled. Without understanding why, he began to believe he had failed. He finally asked whether his father would still take him to important events when he grows older. The question sounds simple, but the aunt heard the fear beneath it. He was not asking about ceremonies. He was asking whether illness had removed him from his father's future. The aunt answered carefully, telling him that adults sometimes make children feel responsible for pain they never caused. The prince's sadness, she explained, comes from love and fear, never disappointment. The future king is not grieving the child in front of him. He is grieving the fact that his son must face something he cannot fight for him. Then the boy revealed something that completely reframes how you understand the timeline. He had noticed his balance changing before the castle fall. He had stumbled in private and hidden it. He had dropped things and said nothing because he did not want his parents to worry. The aunt felt the truth strike hard because his effort to appear brave may have actually delayed the family's understanding. Yet she refused to let guilt replace fear and promised that he would never again need to hide pain to protect the adults around him. When the boy asked her to swear that his father was still proud, she removed a small service pin from her jacket and placed it in his palm. She told him courage is not standing without falling, it is telling someone when help is needed. The prince entered later and the boy spoke before fear could stop him, admitting that he thought he had become a burden. The prince knelt, pulled him close and said, "The family will change every plan necessary, but it will never ask him to earn his place." That promise changes everything because once the boy understood he had not lost his father's pride, the family was finally ready to face the world. The world's response turned out to be more emotional than anyone inside the castle expected. By sunrise, the diagnosis was no longer only a family crisis. It had become a moment shared by millions of parents who understand the terror of hearing that a child's life has changed. Outside the castle, handwritten messages appeared beside flowers and small toys. Broadcasters abandoned their usual language of royal strategy and spoke instead about vulnerability, childhood, and fear. For once, the monarchy was not being watched from a distance, it was being embraced. The prince saw the morning newspapers lead with his joint confirmation beside his aunt, the coverage focusing less on politics and more on the pain in a father's voice and the protective calm of the princess. For one day, that machinery felt almost irrelevant. The public was not asking what the diagnosis means for the crown, they were asking what it means for a child. Medical charities responded with calls for greater awareness. Families began sharing recorded messages and written accounts about treatment, fear, and the long process of adapting to a different future. The prince was moved by their honesty, yet the attention troubled him because sympathy can comfort, but it can also become pressure if a child begins to believe he must perform courage for strangers. The princess refused a proposal for a staged photograph. She would not place her son before the public simply to reassure people watching from outside. She understood that her son was still learning how to name his own fear, and asking him to smile for the nation would turn private confusion into another duty. The aunt offered a different path, a short written response thanking every family that had shared its story with no new medical details and no demand that the boy appear. The prince agreed and then added one personal sentence. His son's worth has never depended on ceremonial duty, physical ability, or public expectation. That line changed the tone of the entire day. At one of the castle's main public entrances, a group of parents placed a blue ribbon around a small toy crown. Beside it rested a card reading, "For the boy, strength is asking for a hand." A national broadcaster showed the tribute during its evening bulletin and called it the image that captured the country's feeling. The prince watched the report privately with his aunt and recognized the message immediately because it echoed the words she had given the boy in confidence. He turned toward his aunt, unable to speak, and she simply nodded. The world had delivered its answer with compassion. But the final verdict still belonged to the prince because he had to decide whether the crown would continue shaping his son or finally reshape itself around him. The diagnosis cannot be reversed by rank, privilege, or tradition. The prince knows this now. He cannot command his son's body to heal, erase the fear from his wife's heart, or guarantee that the road ahead will be easy. But he can decide what the monarchy demands from his son. He can decide whether a child must struggle to fit an ancient institution or whether that institution must finally learn to bend. His final choice becomes the clearest statement of his future reign. The prince gathered his wife, his aunt, and the senior household leadership for one final meeting. The panic had passed. No one was fighting over leaks or statements or canceled appearances anymore. They were deciding what kind of life the boy would be allowed to have. Medical specialists confirmed that treatment may improve his stability and independence, but no one can promise a fixed timeline. Progress will come slowly, unevenly, and without regard for ceremony. The prince admitted that his first instinct was to preserve normality by keeping parts of the old schedule, but he now sees the danger in that decision, because it would have forced his son to prove he could still meet expectations created before the diagnosis. The princess asked the question still haunting her, whether removing every obligation could make her son feel excluded from the family's future. The aunt answered with calm certainty that protection does not mean permanent isolation. It means giving him a genuine choice without guilt, pressure, or public punishment. The prince made the decision final. Every automatic ceremonial expectation placed on his son during childhood was abolished. From now on, he will attend only when he wishes, when his parents agree, and when doctors believe it is safe. The prince went further, establishing a protected family policy, stating that the medical needs of every royal child must take priority over public schedules. His son's diagnosis will not become a private exception hidden behind palace walls. It will create permanent change. The prince lifted the old engagement calendar and tore out the pages carrying his son's canceled duties. Then he placed a blank diary before his wife and said, "From now on, his life is written around who he is, not what they expected him to be." The princess closed her eyes as relief finally broke through her control and placed a hand on the future king's shoulder, because his greatest act of leadership had not been the use of royal power. It had been the decision to limit it. The prince later explained everything to his son, and the boy asked whether he may still attend important events when he feels strong enough. His father smiled and told him the choice will always belong to him. The diagnosis has changed a young life, but it has not diminished him, separated him from his father, or weakened his place within the family. The aunt's loyalty gave them strength. The prince's courage gave that strength meaning, and together they turned tragedy into protection. The crown does not emerge untouched, it emerges changed. For generations, royal children were expected to adapt themselves to duty. But in this moment, duty adapts itself to a child. There is no further secret waiting behind the palace doors and no unresolved verdict left to deliver. The youngest son remains fully loved, fully protected, and fully part of the family. The monarchy will change before it ever asks him to become less than himself.